But this evening, we come really to what I consider in many ways to be the heart of everything we are about as Catholics. There is nothing in my mind more important than Jesus of Nazareth. And if what we as Christians believe about Jesus is true, that God truly became human in him, then everything else in life is different because of that. That's kind of a core conviction. That really is what makes us Christians different than everyone else. So we're going to actually be doing a couple of nights on the person of Jesus, and we're going to start that process tonight. And the next time we gather, we're also going to be looking, is that next week, more deeply, the second part of that. So, and we're actually going to be giving you Bibles tonight. I surprised Jen. I didn't prepare her for this, but she said, sure, we can give you Bibles tonight. So thank you, Jen. Because I'm going to be referring to some of the Gospels tonight. How many of you all come to my Tuesday evening Gospel study? There are a few of you, and none of you are becoming Catholic. That's good. So, because it's going to be a bit of a repeat, some of the stuff that I talked about in my Tuesday night classes, you will hear again tonight, but not all of it by any means, because I'm doing an entire multi-month class in Jesus of Nazareth. I will tell you what I'm going to do tonight and next week on Jesus. I did a one semester, 3-credit college course in Christology, the study of the person of Jesus, and undergraduate work. And when I got to Louvain, Belgium, I had a graduate level study class, an entire year or semester in Christology. So I always think it's fascinating because you could never spend enough time studying the person of Jesus. And, you know, he's at the very heart of our Christian faith. This is where, in my mind, I was about saying the dirt hits the road, or the tire hits the road, or whatever. But it's interesting because in the last century and a half, there has been much historical study done to discover what we can know about the Jesus of history. And, until that time, back in the medieval period especially, there was an assumption made that the four Gospels as we have them were literal accounts of what actually took place. So it wasn't until modern historical scholarship began and people began to study ancient texts with a historically critical understanding of things that people began to ask, the original Jesus of history behind the Gospels, who was he? And I will also add that the early attempts to find the answer to that question were plagued with problems. And the problems that emerged, and one of the people who tried to do that, by the way, was Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers. He went through the four Gospels and he selected the passages that he felt were authentic and eliminated those that were not important. So, in a sense, he created a gospel within a gospel. And the things that he kept about Jesus focused on mainly the moral teachings, how to live a good life. So it's interesting, but the same kind of thing happened with Protestant scripture scholars who were attempting to write the life of Jesus. And so, if you don't know what that is, it's a very rough attempt to draw a well. So they said when these scholars looked back down the well of history to see who the Jesus of history was behind 2,000 years of Christian tradition, what they ended up recreating in their books was their own reflection. In other words, they saw in Jesus who they felt Jesus was. And so they took their own presuppositions into their study, as it were. In some measure, I think all of us do that a little bit, even though we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are certain aspects of Jesus that we are naturally drawn to, and we think, this is Jesus. And there are other parts of the Gospels that we don't know what to do with. When Jesus makes a comment like, if it's your eye that's the problem, gouge it out. If your hand is the problem, cut it off. You see very few Christians who are taking those words of Jesus literally. So we have to begin to interpret them. What does he mean by that? He certainly doesn't want me to gouge my eye out, even though my eye isn't much my problem in terms of keeping me from God. So, or my mouth, or my tongue, what I say. And then there are other moments in the Gospels where, the Canaanite woman comes up to Jesus and she says, would you, please help me? My daughter is critically ill. And Jesus' reply to her is, no, I've come only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then she says, yeah, but, even dogs get eat the scraps, from the table. So they have this dialogue. And for most of us who think Jesus is caring and compassionate and willing to respond to any need brought to him, it's a bit of a shocking passage. So we kind of flip the page to the next section of the gospel, or when Jesus makes a comment like, I didn't come to bring peace to the world. I came to set the world on fire and to create division. A house will be divided against itself. We're thinking, wait a minute, don't you believe in family values? So why are you dividing up households? So there are a lot of things about Jesus in the Gospels that even those of us who believe in Jesus begin to wonder about. So it's no wonder that even careful historical scholars would also pick and choose the aspects of Jesus that they were drawn to. So I say this because I think our relationship to the person of Jesus is decisive for everything else that we will ever answer in life. And there is a point in the Gospels, and you've got, those of you who are making this journey, you've got a Bible in your hand. I'm going to bless those before the evening ends. Please remind me to do that. There is a decisive point in the Gospel of Mark, and I'll do a quick history of Gospels so you get a sense of what we know about Jesus, where it comes from. Jesus was born around 4 to 6 BC. And he died around 30 AD. So the traditional age for Jesus and tradition was 33 years. And historical scholars dating the events that are referred to in the Gospels with the secular events that took place think that that's fairly accurate, somewhere between 29 and 35 years old. So a fairly young man when he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, who is a historical figure. So you sometimes have articles that appear in places like Time Magazine or Newsweek, and they will question whether Jesus ever even really lived. Radical skepticism about historical figures and applying it to Jesus. But in fact, there are references to Jesus even in Roman writings. So we know that there are references to Jesus outside of even the early Christian faith. And there are also references to other historical figures like Pontius Pilate and Herod and John the Baptist that are also known outside of the New Testament. So there are historical figures with which you can date the person of Jesus. So after the resurrection of Jesus, after his crucifixion and after he rose from the dead, the first thing that happened was that the early Christian community, those who believed in Jesus, began to spread the good news of the gospel by word of mouth. And in the end of the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew says, go and preach the good news to all the, to the ends of the earth, and know that I'm with you always. Well, in fact, the early Christian community was on fire to spread the good news of Jesus. And for 40 years, they did that. Until around 70 AD, when someone, and we use the name Mark, as the evangelist that we believe wrote the first of the four, what we call canonical Gospels, the four that are found in the New Testament, wrote down the story of Jesus. So some 40 years after the events took place, Mark writes a very, if you ever read it, how many of you all have read the entire Gospel of Mark? Okay. If you haven't read that Gospel, it's the shortest of the four, it's the easiest to read. It reads like a page turner. It's very about immediately Jesus did this, and then this happened, and then this happened. It's a very intense read. Some people have called it a passion narrative with an extended introduction. So the focus is on the crucifixion of Jesus, and really the rest of the Gospel is kind of leading you up to that significant event in the Gospel. So Mark puts into writing many of the stories that have been handed on by word of mouth for a period of 40 years in the early church. So that period of time we call the oral tradition. And of course, the church would have been preaching the good news about Jesus for those 40 years. It would have been handing on the stories of Jesus. It would have been catechizing believers. They were celebrating what we call today the Eucharist, and would have been preaching in that context. So there were a lot of natural places when the stories about Jesus would have been handed on. One of the ways that I like to describe the Gospel of Mark and the little stories that are in it is each one of them is like a pearl. It has a definite beginning to it, it has a definite end, and it's a core little story. It might be a parable, it might be a healing story, it might be an exorcism, but you can almost take that little story out of the Gospel in many places and simply rearrange it to another part of the Gospel. So the units got handed on the little individual pearls. And you can imagine that's the way things took place. There's a village in the Holy Land that when we went there several years ago, we're driving down the highway, and our tour guide once goes, "Oh, we don't have time to stop, but up there is Nain, N-A-I-N, where Jesus raised that man to life and gave him back to his mother." It was like, "Oh, we're just going to just drive by that little village, you know, and not stop and see it, you know." But so, you know, one can only imagine if Jesus showed up one day in Nain and there was a man being carried on a litter dead and Jesus raised him to life, that story would have been never forgotten, but handed down as an individual unit and eventually becomes part of the Christian tradition. So you could easily see why when Mark writes his gospel, you know, he had all these traditions that he could plug into his account almost at any point, and they could be rearranged if need be. But they're all leading you to the climax, which is the crucifixion of Jesus. The next gospel writers that are connected to Mark are Matthew and Luke. And what is fascinating is when you put those three Gospels side by side, they're very similar. And in fact, scholars not only have realized they're not only similar in the general outline of the story, but even in very close details. So what becomes very clear is that both Matthew and Luke, when they wrote their Gospels, had a written copy of the Gospel of Mark in front of them. So they used Mark as kind of the foundation, and they expanded it. What also becomes clear when you study carefully is that both Matthew and Luke have large sections of teachings of Jesus that are not found in the Gospel of Mark, that follow the same order in both Matthew and Luke, but are spread out differently in those two Gospels. So it's very likely that both Matthew and Luke had access to a second source written that we no longer have, called, the scholars simply call it the saying source. They label it as Q, the German source for, the German word for quell, source. So in writing their Gospels, both Matthew and Luke make use of that second source of very early teachings of Jesus that Mark does not have in his Gospel. In addition to that, Luke has some special material in his Gospel, a lot of very important parts of his Gospel that all of y'all know very well, like the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, the story about the shepherds, the word of Jesus. Those are not found in any other Gospel, only Luke. So that special material in Luke we call L. Well, Matthew also has stuff in his Gospel that none of the other four Gospels have, like the story of the Magi coming to adore Jesus, or that great parable that we're all familiar with in Matthew 25, whatever you do to the least of my brothers, you do unto me. Those things are only found in the Gospel of Matthew, so that is called the M or the MT source. So things found only in Matthew. I'll just say very quickly, when you find something only in Matthew or Luke, it could be that they had a source that the other Gospels didn't have, and it could be that some of it is the composition of the evangelist or the Gospel writer himself to make a theological point. The last of the four Gospels, John, perhaps another 10 years later or so, or even beyond, certainly by 100, extremely unique compared to the other three. It's not one of the synoptics. And he has his own order. Jesus and Matthew, Mark, and Luke is always talking about the kingdom of God. In John's Gospel, he never talks about the kingdom of God. He always talks about himself. I am the bread of life. I'm the light of the world. I'm the living water. So John's Gospel presents the teaching of Jesus very differently. So John is very unique in many ways. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, one of the things that Jesus is doing a lot of is exorcising demons. He doesn't exorcise any demons in the Gospel of John. And also, most of the events that take place in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, until you get to the death of Jesus, take place in Galilee, whereas many of the events in the Gospel of John occur in Jerusalem and around the city of Jerusalem. So a lot of things that make the Gospel of John very distinctive about his portrait of Jesus. But one of the things that I always like to say is that what happened 40 years ago? Where were we? What year in history? 1976. So what was going on in 1976? Who was a famous figure back in 1976?
Bruce Jenner.
Bruce Jenner, Gerald Ford. It was the bicentennial of our nation. If you picked a figure out from the 1970s and asked 4 different people to write the narrative of what happened, you would probably have a lot of common elements to it. But you would also have some really distinct elements, because every perspective presents something from a different vantage point. So when you actually put Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John side by side, they often differ in details and the order of events and the way things are described. But that's partly due to the fact that whenever we end on any story by word of mouth, you all have played the telephone game, it undergoes a transformation based on why we're telling the story, who's remembering it, and yet stories do find a fixed form in which they get handed on pretty quickly. I always use the example of my own childhood. When I was a kid, there was a time, I was a little boy at the time, myself and my brothers got into this fight, and my grandmother was the one who was with us on the square in Lawrenceburg, and we began to chase each other around the car. And my grandmother couldn't catch us, and she got more and more angry as we ran around the car, and she couldn't catch us. When she finally got us in the car, she was so angry, she said, "I'm going to drive you to the convent, and you're going to tell Sister what you did." And we were begging her, "Grandma, please don't make us go to the convent." But she was not to be dissuaded, and we ended up there at that convent. I can still see it in my mind's eye, red brick, ringing the doorbell, and Sister was not there, so we had a reprieve. So the reason I tell the story is, I remember everything that happened. My brothers remember it. I remember the moment we're running around the car, and my grandmother's angry, and I remember the relief we felt when Sister wasn't in the convent. I don't remember anything that happened earlier that day, or I don't even know how old exactly I was, or what happened earlier that week or that month. I couldn't tell you what month of the year it was. And I can't tell you anything else that happened later that day. So that memory is engraved in our brains for some crystal clear reason that we don't forget. And so we've told the story through the years at family gatherings. My brothers remember it. So that's how stories get handed on orally. But I will give you an example of how a later tradition can get added. So we've been telling the story for years, and about 2 or 3 years ago, my mother said, you know, because of that, I never left you with Grandma after that, because she couldn't control you 3 boys. So we never heard that before. So it was like my mother had this little tradition that she had kept that we didn't know anything about. So I always say that's why it might not be surprising in a gospel story, for example, that Matthew and Mark and Luke might tell it a certain way, and then suddenly you get this strange addition. Well, it might be that the gospel writer adds it for a purpose or a point, but it might also be that there was a stray tradition that was remembered by someone that was handed down, or something was remembered differently. So I think the fact that we have 4 distinct gospels is a great gift to the church. And early on, there was someone who tried to blend them together and create what was called the diatessaron. So you could eliminate all those annoying inconsistencies from those 4 pictures and have one narrative that described the life of Jesus. And I'll also add, people still try to do that to this very day. In fact, when you see a movie like The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson, it's beautifully done, but what he did, he blends the 4 gospel and passion narratives into one narrative, and he adds material from Catholic tradition like the Stations of the Cross in. He adds mystical visions from a mystical visionary who had mystical visions about the death of Jesus. So he's blending all this stuff in, but he's trying to make one smooth, single narrative. Well, that's what Tatian did with the diatessaron. And the church elected not to go that route, to preserve a 4-fold gospel tradition. And so we have these 4 unique portraits of the person of Jesus. And each one of them has its own beauty and wonder and goodness. And I always say, if you've never read the 4 Gospels, do it, but start with Mark, because if it was the first one written, and it's likely that it was, then read it, get a perspective on the person of Jesus. If you get a chance to study it, but then go on, and then read Matthew, and then read Luke, and then arrive at John. And you begin to see, in the variety of portraits, you can't capture a mystery like the person of Jesus in one portrait, nor will you ever capture it even once you journey through all 4. So one of the images that I sometimes use, it's like when you go see Mount Rainier in Seattle. The first time I went to Seattle, it was foggy, and I was driving across the George Washington Bridge, and the fog suddenly cleared up. And if you've never seen Mount Rainier, it's so big, it's like it fills up the whole window of your car, and it's like 60 miles from Seattle. You know, I thought it was painted on the sky. I almost wrecked the car. I was shocked by how big it looked. And so, but then I got to go to Mount Rainier. I drove to the park. I went into the park. I stayed in a lodge. I hiked part of it. I drove all the way around it while I was there that summer. I made a complete loop, just like hundreds of miles. And yet every single time I saw it, it was like I never really could get all of it on Mount Rainier. Even though I walked on it, I climbed it, I was there. You know, so there's something about even that is so much, you'll never get it fully. I think that's the same with the person of Jesus. So I talked about last time we gathered the liturgical year, it gives us the chance to keep circling the mystery of Christ so that we discover more and more as we go through our life. And we change as we get older. We become transformed by the experience of knowing this person. So I think getting to know Jesus is a lifelong event. I want you for a moment to imagine what it might have been like to meet Jesus face to face in the first century. I suspect most of us would have a hard time connecting. And we know that because most of the people who met Jesus, including the very religious, by the way, had a very difficult time with him. And so difficult, in fact, that they crucified him. So we have to remember there is something about Jesus that doesn't fit into what the people of his own day were expecting. So I often think if we could go back in time 2,000 years in a time machine, and let's say we could speak Aramaic, the mother tongue of Jesus, that we would instantly know it was him. In fact, I was teaching my Gospels class, and I had mentioned to our secretary downstairs, Gail, I said, well, because we got a lot of people who come to the office who need help for different things. And I said, well, if Jesus showed up, you would probably turn around. She said, I probably would. So it's kind of funny. But, he would probably show up in an unexpected way. But then after she said that, then she said, but I would like to think that there would be some kind of glow around you or something that I could tell. And I think that because of our experience with holy cards and religious films, we often assume that, if Jesus came walking on the set, he would be highly distinct and there would be this glow, we would all know it. Well, in fact, I think one of the interesting moments in the gospel story, where did Jesus grow up? This is my first quiz question. Nazareth, village of a few hundred people in the first century. So Jesus spent about 30 years in Nazareth, growing up. 30 years with about 300 people. So everybody in Nazareth knew Jesus. And that probably a lot of them knew Joseph the carpenter very well. They probably all went to the same synagogue. There was only one synagogue in the village. Extremely well known. There's a story in the gospel that Jesus goes back to his hometown of Nazareth after his baptism by John in the Jordan. And he chooses from the passage of Luke, or the Isaiah, in Luke's gospel you read it, and he says, today the scripture passage is fulfilled in your hearing. And what is the response of those who lived with Jesus for 30 years? Who does he think he is? We know isn't this Joseph's son? Aren't his brothers and sisters our neighbors? I mean, they were all together. He was too much, and they wanted to go toss him over the hill. There's a little chapel at the edge of Nazareth, the chapel of the, what's it called? I can't remember the name of it, the chapel of the tossing over or something like that. They commemorate that point when they're going to throw him off the brow of the hill near Nazareth. So the point that I want to highlight is, if that was so with those who lived most closely with him for 30 years, who were probably trying to do a good job as devout religious people in their own day, and he was a surprise to them, it would be rather amazing if we would feel like that we could walk up instantly and recognize that which was distinctive about Jesus. So we might be also quite surprised by the person of Jesus. On the other hand, there is also something very attractive about Jesus. So attractive, in fact, that at the Sea of Galilee, these guys are fishing, and he says, come and follow me. And they make a decision, these four fishermen, to leave their livelihood, their business, and their families, and they begin this tour around the Sea of Galilee with Jesus proclaiming the kingdom. So a willingness to surrender everything to follow someone is a pretty incredible decision. And so there's something magnetic about him, and we see that also in the Gospels, don't we? Crowds of people are drawn to him and want to touch him and be near him. So the two sides of reaction to Jesus. What I want you to turn to, this is what I call the hinge of the Gospel of Mark. Mark, by the way, is an incredibly dramatic narrator. He draws you into the story of Jesus in such a way that you are really, the narrative that he unfolds is really a magnificent theology that is hidden within it. So if you go to Mark chapter 8, and we'll look at verses 27 to 30. So someone with a loud voice want to read that? Oh, you don't have to have too loud a voice on an extra microphone. Volunteer. A bold person. Mark is looking for a bold person. Justin.
Jared, go for it.
Peter's confession about Jesus. Now Jesus and his disciples set out for the villages of Caesarea
Close enough. Caesarea
Philippi. Along the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They say in reply, "John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter said to him in reply, "You are the Messiah." Then he warned them not to tell anyone about him.
All right, so this in Mark's gospel is this great dramatic turning point. And in Mark's geography, it's the farthest from Jerusalem that they'll ever go, to the north. They're up in Caesarea Philippi, which is at the base of Mount Hermon, where the snows come down and melt in the summertime, and the springs of water that are found there flow down to form the Jordan River, which fills the Sea of Galilee. So it's the beginnings of the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River there. And so they're in a Roman outpost as far from Jerusalem as they're going to get when Jesus surprises them with this question. Basically, who are people saying I am? And you heard they gave a variety of answers. And then the more important question, and I think this is the most important question Mark is trying to answer in his gospel, is, but who do you say that I am? And that question is important for all of us. Who do we say that Jesus is? Now, what answer does Simon Peter give, who is, by any measure in the Gospel of Mark, the leading member of Jesus' followers? He's the spokesperson for the 12. What's his answer? You are the Messiah. Some translations say the Christ, because it's the Greek word Christos. So quick language lesson real quick. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all four written in Greek. Jesus spoke Aramaic, so by the time the four Gospels are written, not only are we 40 years later, but we're also in another language world. So they will sometimes give you the original Aramaic words in the Gospels, like Talitha Kohu, little girl, I say to you, arise, and they'll translate it for us. But in this case, the word Christos, or Christ in Greek, is the translation of the Hebrew word Mashiach, or what we say in English, a Messiah, which literally means someone who was anointed with olive oil. So someone anointed with oil, and anyone that was Jewish knew that to be anointed meant that you were chosen by God for something very distinctive. So in the Old Testament, there were Christs or anointed ones. Who got anointed in the Old Testament? Anybody know who got anointed? Or King David, yeah. So when we think about the Middle Ages, somebody becomes a king, they get a crown on their head. Well, when God chose a king for Israel, the way that God selected him was that olive oil was poured over his head. He was anointed, or christened, we say, with oil. That's how God chose him to be king. So the kings of Israel were known as the anointed ones of God, or the Messiahs, we would say in that language. There were also a couple of other groups that were spoken of as anointed or chosen by God. Who else got anointed with oil for a special purpose in the Old Testament? All right, the Levites, the priests that served in the temple offering sacrifice, were anointed with oil set apart by God for priestly service in the temple. And then also prophets sometimes speak of themselves metaphorically. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. The Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring glad tidings to the poor. I've been chosen by God. So what is Simon Peter, do you think, saying when he says to Jesus, you are anointed, you're chosen? What did he mean by that?
You're a special person. You're unique.
Now, what do you think he meant? You're going to be a priest in the temple? Going to offer sacrifice?
Was he calling out the prophecy from like Isaiah or?
All right, so what was Jesus speaking about all the time in the Gospel of Mark? What's at hand now? The kingdom of God is at hand. I think what Simon Peter is saying is, you're like David. you're going to be the king now. You're going to be the one who's going to bring us all together and restore the tribes. Remember that God's people had been oppressed and occupied for over 300 years. So the Greeks, the Romans. So it had been so long, and they dreamed about the day when God would raise up a new king like David to restore the kingdom. And in the gospel, don't make any mistake about it, when Jesus is going from Jerusalem up to Jericho, Bartimaeus, the blind man, what does he say about Jesus? Who does he call Jesus to be? He says, Son of David, have pity on me. In other words, this is David. This is going to be a son of David, a new king. So, do you think that Simon Peter understood that the kingdom was not what it once was under David? Not so much. Let's go on with that little passage. So, Justin, you still have that microphone. You want to hand it to Adam? All right, so verses 31 to 33.
He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer greatly and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and rise after 3 days. He spoke this openly. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. At this he turned around and, looking at his disciples, rebuked Peter and said, Get behind me, Satan. You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do.
All right, so this in Mark's gospel is the decisive turning point. So if you read the Gospel of Mark, all through the Gospel, Jesus is saying, shh, don't tell people about this. And he raises a girl from the dead, shh, let's keep this quiet. And now you have Simon Peter who says, you are the Messiah, you're the one. And Jesus says, then is the first revelation in the Gospel of Mark about what it really means. The human one, the Son of Man, is going to go to Jerusalem and he is going to suffer and die. And what's the response of Peter to that clear prediction? God forbid that this should ever happen. You know, that's not my idea of kingship. That's not my plan. And Jesus has to rebuke Peter. Get behind me. Follow me to Jerusalem. Now there's a paradox because this is the first of 3 times in the Gospel of Mark when Jesus will clearly say the Son of Man is going to go to Jerusalem and he's going to suffer and die. And each time, Jesus gets more and more detailed. And each time, the disciples don't get it. The second time, let's look at that second prediction real quick. It's a few pages later. Chapter 9, verses 30 through 32. I don't know, I hand that back behind you and see.
They left from there and began a journey through Galilee, but he did not wish anyone to know about it. He was teaching his disciples and telling them, the Son of Man is to be handed over to men, and they will kill him, and 3 days after his death he will rise. But they did not understand the saying, and they were afraid to question him.
All right, so he predicts the second time, they don't understand it, they're afraid to question him, and it's almost, Mark has a sense of humor. It's almost comical, but the very next thing, what do they begin to argue about? So he's going to go to Jerusalem and die, and they start arguing about which one of them is the most important. They came to Capernaum once inside the house. Jesus asked them, what were you arguing about on the way? But they remained silent. Isn't that a human response? When we know we're caught doing something we shouldn't be doing, why did you do that? I don't have anything to say for myself. They had been discussing among themselves on the way who was the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12 around. And he goes on, if anyone wishes to be first, he shall be the last and the servant of all. You know, so the second great question, by the way, the Gospel of Mark is answering, it's not only who Jesus is, but what does it mean to follow him? And what is he saying? It means we have to learn humility. We learn servanthood. This is not about who's going to be the most important or the greatest or number one. You know, so it's a whole different way of understanding what it means to live human life and to be faithful to God, to be the little ones, to be like children, ultimately. And then he says, taking a child, he placed it in their midst and putting his arms around it and said to them, whoever receives one child such as this in my name receives me. All right, then there's a third prediction. And maybe Gloria, you want to read that? I'll hand the microphone over. In chapter 10, verses 32 to 34. Let's see how detailed this will get. Okay, you can see it. Chapter 10, verses 32 to 34.
The third prediction of the Passion.
Oh, by the way, those bold titles in there are added in our modern English translations. They're not there in the Gospels. So it's nice because we can find things, but they're not there. So I always say just, read the text itself.
They were on the way going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus went ahead of them. They were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. Taking the 12 aside again, he began to tell them what was going to happen to him. Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles. Who will mock him, spit upon him, scourge him, and put him to death, but after 3 days he will rise.
All right, so clear third description of what's going to happen. More detail, you notice. And then what's the reply on the part of the 12? James and John have a favor to ask. When he gets there to the kingdom, can they sit on the thrones to his left and right? We're going to go to Jerusalem, we're going to sit there in royal power. You notice Mark, he does have a sense of humor because the 12 are amazed as they're going up to Jerusalem. But the crowd following behind is afraid. They get it. They know this is not going to go well. So they're more realistic than the 12 who are closest to Jesus. It's very paradoxical in the Gospel of Mark. By the way, if you think too in Mark's Gospel, if you think the family of Jesus would have unique insight into him, Mark doesn't present it in a very positive way. In fact, the only two little scenes we get of the family of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark are when he goes home to Nazareth, and also when they come to get him because as Mark puts it, they think he's lost his mind, so they're going to come take him home. But here, they want to have power and greatness, and then the other 10 get angry that James and John ask for those positions. And Jesus says, you don't get it. The funny thing is, right after this third prediction and their third misunderstanding, you have Bartimaeus, a blind man, who gets healed, and he sees Jesus, and he follows Jesus to Jerusalem. That's what Jesus is trying to do for the 12. He's trying to heal their blindness so that they can see who he really is. The funny part is, Mark's structure is very beautiful. Before the passage of Caesarea Philippi, if you flip back, there was a blind man who wanted to be healed down here. He didn't want to be healed. His friends brought him to be healed. And Jesus starts to try to heal him, but he doesn't see very well. He says, well, I see things, but they look like trees. And once he sees, he doesn't follow Jesus. He goes on home. So you have this bracketing of these three passion predictions and misunderstandings, starting with a blind man who has to be led to Jesus and has a hard time seeing and doesn't follow Jesus when he sees. And then by the end, you're Bartimaeus who sees and follows Jesus up to Jerusalem. He leaves his cloak behind like a disciple would. So in Mark's gospel, Simon Peter doesn't give the gold answer. He wouldn't get the gold star. He doesn't get the A+ answer. So for Mark, there's something more about Jesus than simply that he is chosen by God, Messiah. Does anybody know what that something more is? What's more important for Mark? Somebody said in my gospel class, faith is surely important. Seeing is with the eyes of faith. For Mark, the most important thing about Jesus, we're told at the beginning of the gospel, in narrative form, if you go back to chapter 1, let's go to verse 9. This is the first time we meet Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verse 9. Someone want to read that for us?
It happened in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized in the Jordan by John. On coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens being torn open and the Spirit like a dove descending upon him. And a voice came from the heavens, "You are my blessed Son, and with you I am very pleased."
Okay, so here, this is the first moment we meet Jesus in the gospel. The voice from heaven can only be God's voice. And what does God say to his Son? "You are my Son. I'm well pleased with you." The fact that Jesus is the Son, the beloved of God, is for Mark more important than anything else. And he tells us right at the beginning, our first introduction to Jesus. But notice in the Gospel of Mark, it's Jesus who hears the Father speak to him. By the time you get to the Gospel of Matthew, it's an address to the crowd. "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." So that theme of who Jesus is, the Son of God, will unfold further on Mount Tabor, where Jesus is transfigured. And in the presence of Peter, James, and John, they will hear the voice of the Father say, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." He's been trying to tell them what's going to happen in Jerusalem. And the Father says, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." So a second key moment where Mark's gospel reveals who Jesus is at the most important level. Who does recognize Jesus as the Son of God in the Gospel of Mark? John the Baptist does not. No, he misses it. All right, the first person in the Gospel of Mark that is not possessed. The demons recognize Jesus as the Son of God. The world of darkness, they know who has come. We know who you are. You're the Son of God. You're the Son of the Blessed One. But the first person in the Gospel of Mark who is not possessed, who really finally recognizes who Jesus really is, we go to chapter 14. Actually, chapter 15. And someone start for us at verse 37. Chapter 15, verse 37.
Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. The veil of the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom. When the centurion who stood facing him saw how he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God."
All right, first time in the whole Gospel of Mark, and it's not one of the 12. It's a Roman soldier, one of those who were crucifying Jesus, who when he sees, note the word, when he sees how Jesus dies on the cross, he finally recognizes, truly this man was the Son of God. That's the great affirmation of faith in the Gospel of Mark. And it's fascinating because the only thing Jesus says on the cross when he's dying in the Gospel of Mark is, my God, why have you abandoned me or forsaken me?" So it's the moment of the greatest darkness on one level in the Gospel of Mark, of Jesus' utter abandonment. All of the 12 have run away and left him behind in the Gospel of Mark. There are only some women standing at a distance that see him die. No, it's not like the Gospel of John where you have a good thief beside him, or Luke, that's Luke's Gospel, or John with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the beloved disciple at the foot of the cross. In Mark's Gospel, he's left utterly alone. And even that sense of, my God, why have you abandoned me? So that utter moment of abandonment, which he's predicted 3 times, it's at that very moment that the Roman soldier will say, "This man was the Son of God." So I think Mark, by that narrative, is trying to tell us what is most important about understanding who Jesus is can only be understood when we understand that he gave himself for us on the cross. Before that, we don't really get it. We don't really see who Jesus really is apart from the cross. Very, very significant, I think. So in some ways you could say that Mark's gospel is a theology of the cross, an interpretation of the person of Jesus from the eyes of faith, looking at the way that he died for us in fidelity on the cross. So this is a first look at one of the 4 portraits of Jesus. I think it gives you a taste into what the original followers of Jesus, the challenge they had in understanding his identity. And it also will give you an insight into why it took the church a first few centuries of argument and debate to clearly define what we call today the great Christological teachings about who Jesus was. So next week we're going to be glancing at the other Gospels briefly, and we're going to look at that first 300 years or so, first 400 years, and how the understanding of Jesus was clarified and unfolded in the early church. But this gives you at least a first taste. And I encourage you between now and next week, if you have the chance, just simply to sit down one time and read the Gospel of Mark. Probably would take you about an hour or so, or a couple of hours at most, depending on how quickly you read. So sometimes we think, oh, the Bible is incredibly long, I could never read the whole thing. It really is. The Gospel of Mark is really pretty short. It's a doable gospel, so don't be intimidated by the idea that, oh, it's very long and difficult. And it's really a pretty clear narrative. Notice what you are surprised by when you're reading it, and notice what questions emerge in you as you read that Gospel of Mark. So I'm going to let you guys go to your tables in just a moment and do your sharing. But first, we're going to bless the Bibles. So I'll lift those up for a moment. Good and gracious God, you have sent your only beloved Son, Jesus, the Lord made flesh. And in the words of sacred Scripture, we ponder this great mystery of your love. We ask your blessing upon those who will read these Bibles, that in pondering your word they may enter more deeply into the mystery of your love. This prayer we ask and blessing we make. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Have a good discussion.